think the EU has been trying to build a strong relationship with its southern neighborhood. And these relations date back to before the EU, like with the from the colonization, after the end of the colonization period, the European community at that time tried to create commercial agreements with several countries in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. And these were like based on 5 years agreements, mainly commercial, like you need, and they always like were in a way asymmetrical because it favored the European community because it's
bigger player,
etc. And they wanted easier access to the market, especially that the European community was European Economic Community, European Community later, emerging as like a major producer, and they wanted to export their products to neighboring countries. And so the MENA region was a normal market for the EC products. And this stayed till basically the 1990s with the creation of the European Union, with the Maastricht Treaty, and then we had the first real ambitious plan was the Barcelona Declaration 30 years ago. So for the last 30 years, every decade, the EU launched something, a framework. And the question that I think even recently, like which basically after 30 years, we had the Pact for the Mediterranean, and the question I think that all these frameworks do not really answer is what does the EU actually want from this relationship? And is it really honest about it? Because if we look at the Barcelona Declaration, it created the three baskets, which still dominate to a certain extent the relations. And the three baskets were basically the political, economic, cultural. And it largely failed because it avoided the elephant in the room. The same thing happened with the Union for the Mediterranean, which was launched in 2008. And we'll come to that in a second. One of the biggest issues in the region is the EU asking the right question, what does it really want from the relationship? And the second thing is the Palestinian question. And this is the big problem for the entire region. And the Arab-Israeli conflict has been a hindrance in developing the region in many areas. So within 1995, we had the Barcelona Declaration. Then with the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, the European Neighbourhood policy was launched, more economic incentives tied to democratic reforms, but stability has always dominated, especially that with the Big Bang enlargement, we moved closer to the MENA region with Cyprus and Malta joining the EU. So you need more collaboration on illegal migration, terrorism, etc. Then, the Union for the Mediterranean was launched in 2008, and this was basically Sarkozy's initiative, which what it tried to do is depoliticize the relationship, the co-ownership, project-based approach, basically, avoided human rights language, explicit language on human rights, basically to get all the authoritarian leaders into this. And however, also one thing that with the launch of the Union for the Mediterranean, it didn't go fast. And the reason for that, in 2008, there was, I think, the war in Gaza, which dominated the discussions and stalled any real progress. It did create the co-ownership, co-chairing, etc., which was like you have more say in what goes on the agenda. But the war in Gaza dominated, and the peace talks the collapse of the relations between Israel and the Palestinians were dominated also in the discussions. And also for some Arab countries, they always have sensitivity of having Israeli officials in those meetings, etc. Then after that, we had the Arab uprisings. And with the Arab uprisings, which came after the financial crisis, where like the world economy was still in dealing with the repercussions of the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, etc., which had an impact on the money, the flow of money to the MENA region, the number of tourists coming, which put more pressure on their regimes, especially when it comes to employment, socio-economic policies, etc. And it started in Tunisia, and no one expected the first collapse of a regime to be Tunisia, because it was always viewed as like one of the most stable country with a very strong regime, the Ben Ali regime at that time, and no one expected that to see this fast collapse. Like it started by the end in December 2010, I think 17 January 2011, Ben Ali fled the country to Saudi Arabia, where he left for exile. So the demands of the people, especially when you look at the slogans used from Tunisia to Egypt to other places, was more about socio-economic justice, social justice, economic prosperity, more than really democratic, liberal democracy. Let's put it that way. Of course, like in some country, when it started spreading to other parts of the regions, it was more asking for reforms, more freedoms, less brutality of the regimes, etc. And the EU rushed at that time to, okay, there's an window of opportunity that opened, let us push for more democracy. And this is where we had like the more for more principle, the Spring Initiative, the deep democracy, deep and sustainable democracy. And aside from Tunisia, which was considered by the European Union as the success story, and even in the global strategy it was named as a role model for the region. Same thing applied to Georgia at that time, and both basically had democratic backsliding after that. But in Egypt, we had a regime change. We had the first free and fair elections. We had the first, I think, in the history of modern Egypt, we had the first president who doesn't come from the military, Mohamed Morsi. And you like it or not, it was free, fair elections. And then after like less than a year, I think, June 2013, we had the military coup. Mm-hmm. The EU was not sad, basically. European countries were not sad that a military coup happened. On the contrary, they always have sensitivity to a Muslim or an Islamic party ruling. And the situation in Egypt is worse than the pre-Arab uprising. Like it's worse than Morsi's, Mubarak's time. Economic situation is bad. Political situation is more restricted. Yet the EU didn't bother. And I think it was only Ashton who came to check on Mohamed Morsi when he was in house arrest. For the rest of the Union, no. And then after the execution of Morsi, and also now business as usual with Egypt. And I think they had a package of just recently 7.4 billion for Egypt.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned it last time.
Yeah, I think it's 7.4. I think it's 7.4 billion. And this is 7.4 billion. And that's regardless of the situation of democracy, human rights, freedoms in the country, and the high levels of corruption in the Egyptian regime, in which the military is in charge of most of the economy of the country. But that gives you also, like when von der Leyen was going touring around and bribing the countries, we called it bribing, like giving country like Tunisia, Lebanon, etc. Like take $1 billion or so, and then like keep the refugees there, don't let them help us, and then like seriously, is this really how the Union should behave when it comes to values, norms, democracy, the well-being of refugees even? We don't care, just keep them there. And then the 7.4 billion deal with Egypt, it just tells you a lot about the sincerity of the EU when it comes to democracy promotion. So we keep collaborating. After the Arab uprising, there was a window of opportunity to push to be stricter when it comes to democracy, but then business as usual kicked in. The migration crisis came in 2015. The focus of the EU shifted directly. Security first. Let us deal with the border control. Collaborate with the countries more on security, stability. We've seen, like also in Libya after toppling Gaddafi, it's still a conflict, and the conflict of interest of member states at certain moments led to also like they became part of it, like Italy supporting the officially recognized government of the day, and France was supporting more Haftar, which also, like, what union are we talking about? So the situation is not after the Arab uprising, all the hope for some reforms, democratic reforms, it was sort of gone, and we don't even know when another window of opportunity opens for a regime change where people manage to topple their leaders and develop a functioning democracy. There was, coming back to the Iranian question, after the regime was not, it was a matter, I think personally, it was a matter of time before the regime collapses. Because of the really pressures from the sanctions, etc., the economic situation. But what the US and Israel did is they gave the regime a boost.
More legitimacy.
It would not dream of that. And now, this is, I think you heard the joke after the killing of the Ayatollah in the beginning of the war, and then the replacement of the Khamenei with his son. It took them a couple of days to replace Khamenei with Khamenei. It took them 20 years to replace Taliban with Taliban in Afghanistan.
I didn't know it.
And haven't we learned anything from history? Unfortunately, it will take, I think, time before we see some democratic changes, because at the end of the day, the EU's concern is more about security, stability of its borders, not having more refugees coming to the EU, regardless what happens in the neighborhood. So what started as a window of opportunity of democracy collapsed soon afterwards, unfortunately. And the region is ruled with an iron fist by the dictators, from the Gulf countries to from the Western Mediterranean to Eastern Mediterranean. It's almost different levels of brutality. The only country where you had a little bit of more freedoms, democracy, is Lebanon, but it's a war zone, unfortunately.
And we mentioned it at the beginning of the interview. What are the counterparts of these double standards and hypocrisy from the EU? You mentioned Spain. what are the other narrative from these member states?
What do you like for Spain? It has been more like in favor of like sticking to international law, human rights, etc. I think the same with the Irish. So even when they tried to suspend the association agreement with Israel after they launched this law in which they are allowed to execute like prisoners, Palestinian prisoners. Countries like I think France and Germany blocked it. Like if we cannot stand even to suspend an association agreement, to use the power we have, economic powers, to pressure Israel to adhere to our standards of norms, human rights, etc. What is the purpose of all these norms that you keep preaching about? Unfortunately, Spain's voice is not unfortunately, like Spain's voice is well respected in many countries in the global south. I don't like the term global south, but using it as but still, Spain is not a big major player in the EU. And unfortunately, when you look at the German position, I understand the history, but still, and I think you've seen the videos in Germany of violations of human rights, of freedom of protest, etc. How the German police is dealing with this. You see it sometimes in many European countries, which questions like to what extent can we really raise our voices to criticize violations of international law without being labeled as like, oh, like if you criticize such and such, you become like anti-Semite or you become anti so and so. Like, I have the right to criticize violations of international law done by anyone, regardless what. Like if like any country or any group violates international law, it's a violation of international law. If it violates human rights, it is a violation of human rights. I don't care, like, if it is a violation of human rights by one person to one person or many, it's the same. Because at the end of the day, if you inflict harm on any innocent civilian, even if that was just one person, this is something major. And you cannot let it just slide without any punishment or consequences. But unfortunately, what you see with the EU countries is even if they want to criticize certain violations of human rights by Israel or other countries, they shy away from that. And even we gave the example of Iran. Like, we don't like the Iranian regime. We agree on that. It's a bad regime, whatever you want to say. But it's still a sovereign state. What the US and Israel did is a violation of international law. And the only concern for the EU is not, for example, the 160 plus children, the school kids who were killed in the first day, or the amount of damage and destruction that was done by the US and Israel. No, it's just their concern. The main concern for the European countries is the Strait of Hormuz. It's our economic security, our energy security, regardless of who's suffering because of that conflict, regardless of the continuation of the Israel violation of the ceasefire in Gaza, regardless of what's happening in Lebanon. Like, if you look at the southern Lebanon, it's like Gaza. Literally, it's like Gaza now. And have we heard anything from the EU criticizing that? If it's like Israel do not occupy Lebanon, very, very soft language. And how do you want to be viewed positively in the region when you're siding always against the peoples of the region because you think whatever you think, but it does ruin the image of the EU. And things are and here let me put it very clearly. There's a huge difference now. We see a gap between the public opinion and the politicians. So it seems sometimes that the politicians are on one side, and the people, the public, are more pro-human rights, democracy, etc., than the politicians, who are still living that. Yeah, we are guilty of what happened in history, etc. But like, you cannot live saying that everything happened before. We cannot really criticize what Israel did. What Israel did is considered a genocide by genocide scholars, by international organizations, etc. And we shy away from that.
Would you say this difference between the public opinion and the official positions goes hand in hand with the fact that more and more politicians are putting in trials or accused of corruption?
Could be, yeah. Could be. But also, I think one of the main things is that even if we don't see major political changes now, but this will have long-term consequences, because I think you cannot hide what happened. You cannot hide behind your finger and say, we didn't. There wasn't violations of international law. There wasn't starvation was not used as a weapon, etc. You cannot hide it anymore. And the new generation have seen this. It's not when you go protesting for Palestine and for the two-state solution and for stopping the violations of international law, not only in Gaza but also in the West Bank. It doesn't mean you're chanting for killing the Israel. No. And it doesn't mean that you are with Hamas, which you're always like when you go for a protest for Palestine. These are Hamas supporters. No, we are not Hamas supporters. We condemned Hamas how many times about what they did on October 7th. This is call it whatever, like act of terrorism, violation of international law, war crime, call it whatever. We agree. But don't start history from October 7th, ignoring what happened before, because ignoring that, you cannot understand how the EU-MENA relations have evolved, because we mentioned in 2008, with the war in Gaza, this affected the Union for the Mediterranean. And don't stop on October 7th and ignore what happened afterwards and what is happening till now. Either we have a total image of everything that is happening from the Nakba in 1948 till now, or basically selectively looking at that will affect and has affected the image of the EU and the acceptance of the EU by the public in the MENA region. And if you check how the public opinion have shifted over the past years, the EU has always been viewed more positively. Now it goes down, and this is something significant. And if the EU leaders have a sense of just long-term vision or some rationality, they would take this into consideration. But unfortunately, still no.
I have maybe a last question. Would you say the future of the relation between the EU and the Mediterranean countries stick to the situation of Israel and the Palestinian conflict, and or could we see other main topics, main areas where this relation can really shift?
I think maybe let me say institutionally, if we look at the history of the EU relations with the MENA, we could say that it is closer institutionally. Politically, it's further apart. In terms of society, it's more estranged than at any moment since Barcelona. So the EU and its southern neighbors are doing more deals. Like look at the EU with Tunisia, EU with so many countries. The latest was I think the Egyptian one, the 7.4 billion. But those deals are not norm-based anymore. It's more like a transactional. It's more like more transactional, more securitized, less grounded in shared values than ever. And the populations on both sides, the populations on one side versus the EU, trust the EU much less. And the populations on both sides, especially the population in the MENA region, views the population in Europe more positively compared to the elites. Because they did see how people were protesting, going to the streets, some people losing their jobs, being abused by the security forces just because they stood up for against the violations of what happened in Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon, etc. So you see this. I think we see a lot of more bilateral agreements like the EU-Tunisia Memorandum of Understanding, EU-Egypt deal, EU-Mauritania, EU-Morocco, Jordan and Morocco, etc. Like all these agreements are not really partnerships in the Barcelona sense with the three baskets, but they are more transactional packages like money and legitimacy in exchange for migration control energy. And keep in mind, like the literature does talk about how these countries use the EU as a legitimizing tool. Like, oh, we sit with the EU leaders, we talk to them, and that gives them more legitimacy. Now, these also deals, I think to a certain extent, allow the Commission to move fast, avoid scrutiny, exclude human rights conditionality. It is sort of the deconstitutionalization of EU foreign policy in the Mediterranean, because it's not a multilateral agreement anymore in a way.
Bilateral.
It's more bilateral. And I might be wrong or right, but I think it bypassed the constitutional framework in the treaties on the functioning of the European Union in terms of concluding how to do international agreements, etc. So in a way, there is we see this. We see and to give also fairness to the EU, I think the Southern Mediterranean governments have learned really well how to play the EU, and the government increasingly know that they hold leverage, and they can use it. For example, Morocco, in some instances, when it comes to the Western Sahara, they know. We saw it also when Erdogan threatened to open the borders. It's not within the EMP, but still, and that made the EU countries freak out. So they learned how to leverage the high dependency of the EU on those countries' collaboration in terms of security, migration, refugees, and they do play the card really well. And keep in mind that those countries also, the EU is not the only player in town. The Gulf countries are involved, no conditions. The China model of investments, etc. Russia, in terms of security, we've seen Russia more and more involved in in Libya and other places with the Wagner groups, and so you see that the EU is not the only player in town, and that also affects the leverage the EU have over those countries. So this is something. Also, we see that sometimes I think those also countries could play member state of each other. So, for example, I think Morocco with Spain on the over like one of the islands and migration, not Melilla, the other one.
I don't know the name.
Safta, I think. Tunisia, like with Italy, Turkey with Greece, with respect to migration. Each bilateral vulnerability is exploited individually by MENA countries vis-a-vis EU member states. And I think the EU's collective framework should protect against this. But member states go around it. And for their own short-term interests, which actually makes the problem even worse. And even if the EU tries to push, we want to stick to human rights, etc., those bilateral agreements and member states calling the shots does not help the EU as an EU to push in for that. For example, for Italy, it was more migration first driver, especially when it comes to Tunisia or Libya. But this also relates to the lack of unity within the EU. When they tried to have this burden sharing, many countries refused, and then this burden became on the port of entry. Greece, Italy, so all the Mediterranean countries. For example, in Gaza, we saw that Germany was the main blocker of anything that can take place. Which also blocking, for example, the suspension of the association agreement, the arms exports to Israel still mostly ongoing, preventing any real meaningful EU level response to the ICJ rulings. And I think in doing so, it has made the double standards of the more visible and permanent, damaging not only the EU credibility in the Mediterranean, but across the entire global south. France, for example, is more relationship with its former colonies is more related to domestic politics and strategy and interest. What we see also France vis-a-vis with Lebanon, because it still considers Lebanon as the
main partner of...
Yeah, and also it does consider Lebanon as the main French creation in the region, during the Sykes-Picot agreement. Spain had to give up for Morocco when it came with respect to the Western Sahara. You see a rise of the anti-colonial sentiment. Also, we see a call for decolonization of the literature even. So not only at the policy and at the public level, but also in academia, we see this asymmetrical treatment or asymmetrical relation, the EU as the superior and the others as more. There has been a pushback by the global South countries that we're not colonies anymore, and you cannot treat us as what is the best for us. And I think this call has been more and more spreading in the global South. And look, for example, a lot of countries in the global South, they do see Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine as violation of international law. But how many sided with the EU on that? Very little. And when Europe asks the global South to support a rule-based international order, the response is increasingly, whose rules? and enforced against whom? And this is, I think, the Mediterranean is where the credibility gap is most visible and most damaging, because these are Europe's closest neighbors, and they are bound by history, trade, security, migration. But when we see how the EU handles certain conflicts that that are very important to the MENA region, you see that the EU turns a blind eye. And as I said, without a proper solution of the Israel or of the Arab-Israeli conflict, not the Trumpian way, not the Israeli way, like negotiations under fire, which you could achieve a deal, but is it sustainable? No, because I think the image of the EU, the image of Israel in the region has deteriorated for generations. And I think the relationship between the EU and the MENA, I wouldn't consider it like closer or further apart. I think it has become more asymmetric and more contested. Governments are doing more deals, but on terms increasingly set by southern partners who have learned to exploit European vulnerabilities. And I think at the societal level, which is, I believe, the level that determines the long-term partnership, the relationship have been more damaged at any point since the Barcelona Declaration. And I think the Pact for the Mediterranean arrives into this context and has to be judged on whether it can reverse any of these trends. I'm not that optimistic it will, because given how the EU still behaves, it's still business as usual. And I think, and this is what I can say, that the evidence, although it's very short, suggests it cannot, because it is, or it repeats the same structural error, treating government as partners while ignoring the demands and the populations of the region. And I think this is the biggest problem. And as I said, like if we look at the short-term evaluation of the Union of the Pact, I think we see the same problem repeated over and over.